Hi, this is Sofiya Pasternak, author of Anya and the Dragon and Anya and the Nightingale. I identify as a white, Ashkenazi, Jewish cishet woman with mental health diagnoses. I'll be joining you soon on the podcast to talk about my own voices book, which centers a Jewish girl in 10th century Russia who has to make the hard choice of either saving a dragon or saving her family. But I'd also like to use my privilege to boost Black voices. I want to recommend the book Color Me In by Natasha Diaz, because this book, which is about biracial Jewish teen Nevaeh Levitz, presents a side to Jewishness that I think Ashkenazim like myself rarely have to face. And it's a frank look at what privileges exist within the Jewish community itself that are based on heritage and skin color. I hope you'll give this lovely and sometimes very difficult book a chance.
This is The Book of Life, a show about Jewish kidlit mostly. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Anya and the Dragon was Sofiya Pasternak's debut, a middle-grade Jewish fantasy novel that won a 2020 Sidney Taylor Honor Award. It will soon be joined by a sequel, Anya and the Nightingale. As we get ready for Anya's further adventures, let's talk to Sofiya to explore the roots of the story. Sofiya, tell us about Anya and the Dragon.
Anya and the Dragon is a middle grade fantasy novel about an 11-year-old Jewish girl in the 10th century in Russia, and she has to team up with the village idiot to save a dragon. And there's a goat.
And there's a goat. Hornbook magazine described the book this way. They said, Anya and the Dragon, who's not so bad, live in Russia before it was Russia, a place where Christianity, Judaism, and ancient magic coexist uneasily. What do you think of that description?
So I tried to take that part of my story from like actual history. And at the time period in this point in history, Russia, or Kievan Rus, it wasn't Russia back then, but it had just very, very recently become Christian. They had been Slavic pagans up until that point. And then Vladimir won, who I named my Tsar Casimir just because I thought Vladimir might be a little topical. So I changed his name. He decided that he wanted the whole country to be Christian. And there's a couple of different stories about it. But either way, wherever it happened, he made everybody Christian. And his grandfather, decades earlier, I can't remember exactly how many years prior, had actually destroyed the Khazar Empire, which was a Jewish empire where Ukraine kind of is right now. It wasn't because they were Jews, it was just because they were in the way and he wanted their stuff, so he destroyed them all. And there were some Jews in Kiev, but it was basically because they didn't have anywhere else to go, so they stayed. So they were kind of outsiders, and they weren't necessarily unwelcome, but it was like, okay, they're here, I guess, and they didn't force them to convert, which was nice because everybody else had to. It was kind of uneasy just because of the recent history that had kind of gone on. So I kind of included that a little bit in my story. Out in the country where Anya lives, she would have been very strange to be not Christian and not pagan.
What inspired the story?
A lot. My very, very favorite fairy tale. I had been trying to retell it for forever. And I kept trying to make them adults because in the fairy tale, they're adults. And it wasn't working and it wasn't working. And so finally one day, it just kind of popped into my head like, fairy tales are for kids. Make them kids. And I did. And originally Anya was 13, I think. And I aged her down a little bit. But the younger version of the story was so much better than the adult version I was trying to tell. It just fit so much better in with the characters' personalities and kind of what was all going on. So it started out with retelling one of my very favorite fairy tales from when I was a kid. And then I wanted to incorporate history into it. I really, really like historical fiction, historical fantasy. The constraints on it make it fun. to write, I guess. You have to be creative in trying to get around things, put a fairy tale back in real history and see what I can do with it. I was like, well, let's add in some, Jewish folklore and Jewish myth, but I don't want to do like a Dybbuk and I don't want to do a golem. I want to do something that people don't really know about. So I included an Iber, which is like a nice Dybbuk. And then there are a couple of other things in the story, like the dragon being red is significant and a couple other things, like goat. She's a little white goat. Little things that hopefully my Jewish readers are like, I see what you did there.
So what was the original fairy tale?
The original fairy tale is Norwegian, actually, or Norse. I think it might have predated the differentiation between the countries up there. And it's called The Lindworm Prince. And it's almost like a Princess and the Frog type of story, but he's not a frog, he's a dragon. And the way the story is told is that the king and queen really wanted children, and the queen couldn't get pregnant, so she went to a witch and asked for help. And the witch was like, oh yeah, I got a spell for this. She said, go home and eat a raw onion. And the queen's like, that's it? And the witch was like, well, but the queen was like so excited she ran out the door before the witch finished her sentence, which is something that you should never do. You should always wait till the witch finishes her sentence. And so the queen ran home and she grabbed an onion and then she was like, well, maybe I want 2 babies. So she grabbed 2 onions. And she ate the first one with the peel on and it was really gross and awful. And so she peeled the second one and then ate it raw and then got pregnant. Hooray, the queen's pregnant. She's going to have a baby. Hooray, we're so happy. The day comes and she's giving birth and the midwives are all there. And the first baby to be born is a dragon. What the heck? And kind of freaks out. One of the midwives is like, ew, and grabs it and just flings it out the window. And then the second baby is a regular baby. They never check up on the dragon to see what happened to it, but it lived and grew up in the forest. And somehow in this fairy tale, it knew that it was a prince. I'm not sure how. And the human prince is, growing up doing his thing and he's riding around one day and all of a sudden this dragon comes out of the forest and is like, I'm supposed to be king, so I'm going to start wrecking up the place until you guys acknowledge that I'm the rightful heir. So obviously this causes some stress and I don't want to give away the end of the fairy tale. If people really want to look it up, they can. But the girl who essentially breaks the spell is just kind of a nobody. They try to get all these princesses in and none of them work out and the dragon doesn't like any of them. So the girl who finally shows up is just kind of a nobody from nowhere and breaks the spell. But I won't go into how. Spoilers.
Okay, that's, yeah. Cool. What an interesting story to base your story on.
It's something I've really loved since I was a kid because the princess, the female protagonist in it, isn't in a tower waiting to be rescued. She's actually the one that shows up and is like, you idiots, and does the thing that she needs to do to solve the problem. And I really like that. She has agency and gets what she wants in the end. So I like it.
Cool. One of the things I found particularly interesting in this book was how you so naturally incorporated Torah study into this fantasy novel. Anya doesn't just identify as Jewish, she lives Jewish. So can you talk about that aspect of the book?
That aspect was not there at first because I wrote this and they were kind of secretly Jewish. I knew they were, and I wrote it so that if someone who was Jewish was reading it would maybe be like, huh, and get it. But in the very first couple of drafts, there was no Torah. They didn't specifically say that they were Jewish, nothing like that. And then I got into Pitch Wars in 2017, and my mentor read it, and she kind of picked up on it, and she was like, yeah, are these characters Jewish? And I was like, yeah, they are. And she said, I think you should really add that in. I think you should make that a bigger part of it. And I was like, are you sure? Are people going to want to read a fantasy with a Jewish character in it? And she was like, oh yeah. It was so easy to add it in. This was what was missing all along, and this totally belonged here. And I can't believe this book existed at some point without it. I was afraid of people, I guess, excluding it automatically because they would be like, I don't want to read about a Jewish girl. But I was really surprised at how excited people were about it, even people who weren't Jewish. I live in Utah. There's not a lot of Jewish people around here. So most of my local readers are Mormon, actually. it was really cool to have my religion not only read about, but like they really loved it and they were really excited about it. So it's a great feeling.
Awesome. Obviously, readers need to suspend disbelief for the magical parts of the story, but they may find it harder for some of the alternate history, like Anya having a bat mitzvah in the days before girls really had bat mitzvahs, or the surprising tolerance of the Christian villagers. So what would you say to readers who get hung up on that?
So the tolerance of the villagers toward her religion is that particular village would have been very far out in the middle of nowhere. They're not metropolitan at all. A lot of them probably have never even been to a different city, or maybe like the one next door. And they were all pagan 20 years ago. They just changed over religions, and they don't really have any opinion about Jews at this point. They don't really know them that well. Maybe the only thing they would have known would have been if any of them were familiar with the Khazars. The Khazars are kind of a fun story. They're kind of an interesting little microcosm of Judaism, because the king of the Khazars, and I can't remember his name right now, it started with a B and I'm brain farting. According to the lore, he basically had a dream where like an angel came to him and said, "Hey, you should be Jewish." And he was like, "Okay." And so he woke up and he went to one of his advisors and he was like, "I had a dream and an angel said we should be Jewish." And his advisor was like, "What's Jewish?" And he was like, "I don't really know, but let's learn." So he went and gathered some information about what being Jewish was. And the Khazar Empire was very receiving of refugees from various places. And it was very heterogeneous. There was no real official religion. I believe before Judaism, they were Tengri. I think in Siberia in modern day, they're still Tengri. But it's monotheistic. And so the switchover wasn't too difficult. And they were very welcoming of other faiths. They had Jews already in the country before the whole country became Jewish, and they already had Muslims and they had Christian. They already had like everybody there. And so they were like, okay, like let's go find some Jewish people and ask them what's up. So the king converted, and I believe that a lot of his advisors and like the upper echelon of society did. He didn't make it mandatory. He didn't have to. And so we don't really know how the Khazars observed Judaism. So I kind of went with that, and I was like, well, who's to say that they didn't have bat mitzvahs? We don't know.
So you must have done a lot of research to write this novel. Was there anything really cool that you learned that you just couldn't fit into the finished book?
So much. I eventually settled on the time period is right at the end of the 900s. It's like 999, I think. But the folklore that I included spanned between about the 10th century and I think probably like the 14th, 15th. When at first, and I was trying to figure out where to locate the story in time, I had to do a lot of research on all of those different time periods. And something really cool that they weren't doing yet, but they did later. In the 10th century, the country converted to Christianity. And back then, for about 60 years, they were Roman Catholics. And then I want to say in like 1054, that's when the schism happened and the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Church diverged. So the type of Catholicism that the Russians practiced became much different than it was in Rome. For this reason, a lot of the Western European countries would not marry into Russian families because they were these weirdos from the East that practiced weird Catholicism. And the Russian response was, well, we didn't want you anyway. We're going to just stick with ourselves. And so they did these things called bride shows. It's very Cinderella. These girls from nice families, but not royal families, were brought to whatever the capital happened to be at the time, dressed up in your fanciest clothes, and you met the prince, and if he liked you, he'd marry you. And the point was to keep meddling and interference out of the Russian house. And like, we're Russians, we do things the way that Russians want to. And the bride shows were apparently like a complete nightmare for everybody involved because there was meddling anyway, because like, you know, you're going to do. And I think they did that for a couple hundred years. And it was actually based on a Byzantine tradition that they used to do. And reading about that was like so fascinating. But there's nowhere for me to put it into this particular story. I'm saving it for later. It got tucked into my save for later box. But the first time I read about it, I was like, this is where they got the Cinderella story idea, because this is literally what she does. Wow, that was a real thing. I thought that was made up for Cinderella.
Right, right.
Yeah.
On Goodreads, several reviewers said they wish there had been a glossary for some of the Russian words that you use. And you did a pretty good job of defining terms in the text, but can you expand on a few words for us right now? I have a few words that I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
Talk about the domovoy.
So a domovoy, if you are familiar at all with an English brownie or Dobby the house elf, that's a domovoy, except they've got big beards. Like, you have a beard if you're a man in Russia. Like, just have a beard. The domovoy is ancient. This dates back to when the whole country was still pagan, and this was one of, like, the household gods. Domovoy lives in your house, and then there's a different one, and I cannot remember its name, but it lives out in your barn with your animals, and they don't like each other in some stories. But the domovoy lived in your house, and he just kind of hung out, and if you kept him happy, he would bring good luck to your house, basically, and he would make it like a very nice, harmonious place to live. And in the winter, your wood would burn better, and your food would last longer, and all the animals would be healthy, and everyone in the house would stay healthy. But if you made him mad, he basically turned into like a poltergeist and would just wreck up the place. He lived in the hearth, and you would leave little treats for him at the hearth. In some stories, he just looks like a little old man, but in some stories, he looks like the head of the house. And the head of Anya's house is Jewish. Her dad converted. And so I was like, well, the domovoy is now too, because that's what he does. He follows the leader of the house, the head of the house. So that's why he wears a little kippah, because he's a Jewish house god, I guess.
Adorable. What's a rusalka?
Something kind of interesting about a lot of these old Slavic fairy tale creatures is the version of them before the Christianization of the country, and then the version of them from after. So originally, a rusalka was a fertility goddess. They lived in the rivers. They were beautiful women. Beautiful female spirits in Russia are like hit or miss. They may kill you and they may not. It's safe to just stay away. And the rusalka, they might drown you, they might not. But in general, prior to the Christianization of Russia, they were just fertility spirits. And they had Green Week, the time when the rusalka could come out of the rivers, and they would walk up in the fields and make everything green and bring rain and good luck. And they were very beneficial creatures to have around. And then after the Christianization, they became the drowned souls of women who had either been murdered or they had jumped in on purpose and drowned themselves. And that's when they became like very aggressive, and they would always kill you. There was never that ambiguity. And if there was a rusalka haunting the waterway near your house, you would have to put them to rest. And the stories vary, but the most popular theory that I read was that you have to find either the person who killed them and bring them to justice, or you have to find the body and bury it in like a good Christian manner. A rusalka is kind of a siren almost, but they were in rivers, not in oceans. And they didn't so much sing. They were just really pretty, and they would kind of lure people in just by being pretty.
Let's do one more. And tell me if I'm saying this right. What is a zmejak?
That is imaginary. I made that up. So,
good.
It would be a zmejak. Zmi is how you say snake or dragon. The ak ending is like kind of like a diminutive and makes it like little snake, or in the story it's dragonling, I think is how they meant it. There's horned snakes in a lot of different mythologies. I don't think that the Slavs had a horned snake really, but the Celts did. They were Native American tribes who had horned snakes. I want to say somewhere in Africa did, but I don't know for sure if they had horns or if it was just a snake. So snakes are very mystical in a lot of different places, and they carry this negative connotation in a lot of places too. But in general, they were good luck. They were associated with like water and rain and stuff like that. And these are just animals. They don't really have a particular magic of their own, but they were associated with dragons because they kind of look like them. So people don't want to make them mad, just in case.
Okay, good. I think it's adorable that you interviewed yourself on your blog, which is called The Book Goat, and I'll link to that in the show notes.
Well, thank you.
How did you decide what to ask yourself?
So, because I interviewed all of the novel 19s.
What are the novel 19s?
Oh, sorry. The novel 19s are all of the debut middle grade and young adult novels that came out in 2019. I don't know how long it's been going on for, but at least back to 2017. Every year, all the debut kidlit authors will form a little group. They're so supportive and so great, and I probably wouldn't have made it without them around. And so I was like, oh no, pressure. I have to make it like a good interview. But I went and I just looked up, I think I got close to 300 different questions just from all these different sources of what other people had asked. And I put together my favorites that kind of applied to debut authors. I think the total questionnaire might have 20-ish questions in it. I think I answered most of them. I might have skipped one.
And your blog is called The Book Goat. What is your deal with goats?
So
they're all over your website.
They are. I wish I could add more, but I think it would be overload. I grew up in Florida in the 80s. And I guess back in the 80s and 90s, I don't really remember. I was very small back then. Goats became like a fad pet. And I don't know if this was just in Florida because Floridians are weird or if this was everywhere. But
I live in Florida right now, so
you?
yes. Floridians are weird.
Yeah, a little bit. There's something in the water. We lived out in the country, so we lived at the very end of this really long, kind of lonely road, and it was just us. And people would buy a goat and think like, oh, fun, I'm going to have a goat. It's going to mow my lawn for me and eat my weeds. And that's not what happens. They will climb on everything, and they'll headbutt stuff, and they will eat everything, literally everything. And they get bored, so they'll get destructive. And if you just get one, they're herd animals, so they'll start misbehaving because they want a friend. And so people got sick of this fad goat pet, and you can't just take it back to the goat store, I guess. So they would drive them out to the country, and they would just leave them on the side of the road kind of near our house.
Aww.
Yeah. And my mom is a huge animal lover. She will adopt anything with fur. We had 11 acres, and at the time, I think we had some cows. We didn't have really much of anything else. And so these goats just started appearing like at the end of the driveway. And she was like, well, I guess we have goats now. And she would just start bringing them in and adopting them and naming them as they came in. And I think we ended up, there's like 20 of them. We had a big herd of goats. They're just hodgepodge. Not one type in particular. We had any goat you can think of. And she learned on the fly, like how to take care of goats. I have a coffee mug that is me as a baby. And then there's a little goat standing next to me. And my sister put it on a coffee mug for me. So every photo album I have from me as a kid is me in a diaper next to a goat or a dog. So I grew up with goats. I really love them. They have a lot of personality. They're really funny. When my husband doesn't know this yet, but as soon as I get out of graduate school and we move somewhere that I can have a goat, we're getting a couple of goats. He doesn't know it yet, though. I don't know if I'm going to tell him. But I just really loved them. They're such cool animals, but you have to know how to take care of them or they will be very obnoxious.
It was fun to have their personality coming through in the book.
Zvezda is based off of a Nubian. Zvezda's not a Nubian goat. Back then, that breed wouldn't have existed. They would have been brown, not white, but I made him white because I wanted him to be white. But we had a Nubian named Randy who Zvezda was patterned after. It's kind of how he acted. So
now it's Tikkun Olam time. What action would you like to invite listeners to take to help heal the world?
So I've been excited about this one. So I'm a nurse. My very first adult job was critical care and specializing in head trauma. That's a really, really intense job to go into. And, you work 12-hour shifts and I work nights and you give so much of yourself night after night after night. And burnout is really big and really bad. And I also worked in emergency departments and you can burn out really fast if you're not careful. There's some nursing wisdom and it's you can't fill a cup from an empty pitcher. You have to take care of yourself if you want to take care of other people. So my call for Tikkun Olam is to take care of yourself, because if you're not taking care of yourself, then you can't take care of other people. It's okay to take some time to do something that you want to do, to say no to people if they ask you to do something or other and you feel like it's really going to run you down. Everybody out there, make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and bringing your best to the table is through making sure that you're healthy.
Good. Yeah, it's like on the airplane when they say, please put on your own oxygen mask before helping others.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
The sequel to Anya and the Dragon, Anya and the Nightingale, it comes out in November of 2020. It's a different Russian fairy tale, the story of Ilya Muromets and Nightingale the robber, but with a little bit of a twist on it. And in this one, Anya goes to Kiev and she meets other Jewish people, and it's kind of a culture shock for her. It was fun to write, but it was also way harder to write than Anya and the Dragon was. It covers some bigger things, so I really love it, but I'm kind of afraid of the reception it's going to get.
Why are you afraid of the reception it'll get?
Well, when you step out and do like things that are kind of tackling harder topics, some people might not like that, and some people take it in ways you didn't intend. So far, everybody who has read it has liked it, but they've also been my friends, so they have to say they like it. So we'll see. I hope people like it.
Sofiya Pasternak, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Hi, my name is Amy Ginsberg Bickel. I'm the author of Theodore Bickel's The City of Light, and I will be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast. I would like to dedicate this podcast to all of the young activists who are out on the streets right now in the United States, in Israel, and in so many other countries, fighting courageously and with open hearts for all of us, for our democracy and for justice and for civil rights and for the world that we and they see as a perfect world. I would like to have them in our hearts and in our minds, even if for obvious reasons we've decided not to ourselves to go out onto the streets at this moment.
Don't be a stranger. Say hi to Heidi at 561-206-2473 or bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com. Check out our Book of Life Podcast Facebook page or our Facebook discussion group, Jewish Kidlit Mavens. We are occasionally on Twitter too, at Book of Life Pod. Want to read the books featured on the show? Buy them through bookshop.org/shop/bookoflife to support the podcast and independent bookstores at the same time. You can also help us out by becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation to our home library, the Feldman Children's Library at Congregation B'nai Israel of Boca Raton, Florida. You'll find links for all of that and more at bookoflifepodcast.com. Our background music is provided by the Freelach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.